So welcome back to this next lesson, and this one is on empathy and projection. Two very important topics, two very important ideas to understand in the journey of shadow work, both inner and outer. We've covered this already in depth in the previous course, so we're going to be just sort of recapping it here, but just also applying it to this topic of outer shadow work and why it's important. Why it's important is that, well, firstly, these two words are somewhat synonymous. They're actually talking about, in part, the same function of mind, this intentionality, this movement out to experience as a way to know the self. So empathy, as it's commonly thought of as being like experiencing someone else's pain, yeah, that's like one way that it can show up, but it's actually more than that. It's really this willingness to meet and be transformed by experience of the world and experience of ourselves as well. This is why that those who have a great deal of empathy and a great deal of potential to realize themselves might be called empaths and might also get strung along more than others, right? Because some part of them wants to engage and evolve, and it sees themselves in the other and the other in the self. So it's engaging in this transformation, or trying to, but maybe at the relatively early stages, it's confusing the mere relief or happiness of the other for genuine progress and connection. And so, of course, this world contains a lot of folks who aren't actually interested in that and have learned to actually imitate that and cotton on to the empathic person's tendencies and regulate themselves and their own avoidance of themselves by leaning on the other. So projection, seeing oneself in the world, is actually the same thing. It's just that projection has other connotations, and it maybe applies to just certain kinds. We're going to be recapping those in a minute. But the sort of traditional understanding of projection deriving from Freudian psychology doesn't really take us far enough. And likewise, the conventional understanding of empathy certainly doesn't take us far enough. It serves some practical usefulness in the world, but it doesn't actually provide any kind of psycho-spiritual understanding, and therefore has limited use in self-knowledge and becoming who you really are, and achieving a more dynamic synthesis, becoming a self, not just leaning on science, not just leaning on superstition or mysticism, but coming to truth. So this is sort of, I think, the bullseye for much of our culture right now. There's some other things to sort out first. There's a lot of issues with, obviously, materialism and misplaced humanitarianism and so on. But actually, this is sort of like the key next step, I think, is to achieve selfhood and synthesis. So very important subjects to understand, because projection is so useful as a way to do shadow work, to understand where we might be seeing our shadow in the world. But here's the thing, we have to also understand empathy, because otherwise we're at risk of simply judging ourselves. And I discussed at length in the previous course how if you just say, I suppose it's my projection then, and if you allow someone else just to tell you, like a corrupt coach, just to tell you that, well, yeah, it's just your shadow projection, that's all this is. Well, you're simply trading one projection for another there. You're simply no longer projecting your apparent evil onto the world, and you're simply projecting your own capacity to call evil for what it is onto the world. Because now you've outsourced that to someone else, and they're judging you as evil and calling you judgmental for the favor. So we have to be able to do this ourselves, and this is why I've actually delineated projection and empathy into 8 varieties. Because if you have had a close encounter with a pathological controlling individual, it's very important that you are able to delineate the various kinds of projection that might have been involved. Because otherwise you run the risk of simply judging yourself for judging them, for judging yourself as seeing them as evil and it was just all your evil all along. And it may well be that you shared some of those traits and you were maybe seeing a kind of flavor of yourself. There was something in it, but maybe you were doing it in support of freedom and honesty and selfhood, and maybe they were using that energy in violation of it. So you see, it might be the very same energy, but the intention itself was different. You might have been attracted to your ex-partner's way with words and their social finesse, and maybe you felt like you're a little bit more shy and in need of some support in that area. But then it doesn't mean that you are going around now and judging people and misleading them and deceiving them. Maybe you do aspire to the ability of having this social skill and these communication skills and maybe charisma and so on. And maybe that's a real part of you. But that says nothing about your intention behind the use of that energy, that trait. So it can make a lot more sense when we start to think of these functions of mind and our behaviors and intentions in terms of energies as opposed to sort of isolated traits. So when we do shadow work, we might make the mistake of talking about, like, say, aggression or selfishness or kindness. But really, every trait has both a positive and a negative side, because it can be used in excess to the disregard of whatever is opposite to it. And it can also be used deliberately in violation of that need for synthesis, i.e. in service of the egocentric self, and also in violation of freedom, of other people's freedom, maybe even one's own. So with that all said, let's go next to a quote from Michael Tsarion. So this is from his book, Understanding German Idealism. And he said, talking about Hegel here, obviously, Hegel laboured to point out that early on in history and the mind's investigation of itself, the other person is irrationally objectified and not regarded as instrumental in the process of self-knowledge. Both parties are inclined to approach each other with hostility and fear. At this stage, we have what Hegel termed the master-slave relationship. Eventually, this tense, mutually negating dynamic will be overcome, but only when each party realizes the cardinal rule, namely that each discovers more about themselves by experiencing the other. In other words, by practicing empathy. I say practicing empathy, by using empathy, by having empathy. It is something you can practice, it is something you can cultivate, and it is absolutely something you can abuse and violate and disregard. This is actually the difference between pathological types and empathic types, right? Is whether they've chosen to cultivate empathy. Maybe certain challenges in their lives have rendered them into a perpetual master-slave dynamic, which they struggle to ever see a way out of. I've made the case that despite the challenges there, you can always find a way. It might be an almighty challenge. But even if your childhood was 20 times worse than the average, it doesn't excuse one from putting out 100 or 200 or 1,000 times more harm out into the world. So there's no excuse for not doing inner work. There's no excuse for not using empathy. There is free will involved. But I just want to highlight a couple of key things from this quote again. So the master-slave relationship is an early stage position in the path towards self-knowledge. It occurred early in history. It still occurs pervasively now. As Hegel said around the same time, 200 years ago, that history is the progression of consciousness of freedom. And you can use this to understand a lot of what's going on in our modern age, the way that culture's moving, the way that politics moves. But even within the life of an individual, this master-slave dynamic is indicative of areas where something isn't being seen and where empathy isn't being used. So it's fundamentally self-contradictory, because it is essentially the phenomenological form of doing to others what you do not want to be done to yourself. So it's unstable because, firstly, in subjugating others, their recognition becomes worth less to you. But also their own self-worth actually can increase, because whoever you've subjugated actually has a bit of an advantage in a way, in that they can come to realize skills, they can come to produce something, and they get their recognition, therefore, to a degree, internally. So yes, there's a sort of a stereotypical form of this, but bear in mind, this is not a single moment in time. This is actually something that is happening on multiple levels at various frequencies and amplitudes throughout our lives. So we might have transcended this dynamic in 99% of our lives, at work and in certain situations and in most of our relationships. But there might still be a small number where actually, unknown to us, we're still getting involved in master-slave relationships. And wherever there's been a shadow dynamic, most likely it's synonymous with a master-slave relationship on some level. Bear in mind that this doesn't necessarily mean that you have been abusing others in the sense of a master. Maybe you have stuck your hand out to be a slave. In doing so, you've also violated yourself. And then you've entered into an unstable situation. And this can also be, and often is, by the way, also an internal dynamic. So the narcissist is someone who has absolutely destroyed themselves internally through the master-slave dynamic. They are a complete slave to themselves. They're a complete slave to the superego and the persona. In fact, it's almost like the true self has given up. So there are some who think that actually, in the case of a narcissist, the true self is actually completely given up, is essentially murdered. So they continue to exist in some existential form, but they've actually denied any possibility of any transformation with the world. So they've regressed into a womb-like state, and just they're now demanding that the world subsumes to their needs. So this situation, at whatever scale, is transcended when it dawns on you through experience and through empathy and through suffering and through misalignment, and making that link that one actually learns more about themselves by experiencing the other. I experience negation from the other. And in understanding this, we can engage in a much more sophisticated dynamic. It's no longer really a dynamic at that point. It's an interaction. It's a relationship with the world around us and with other people around us. So you see, shadow work is not merely about, you just projecting your own evil onto other people. That's one kind of projection, and there's 7 others I'm going to talk through that are very relevant to this. So I've already described how empathy is a willingness to meet and be transformed by experience, and projection is the transfer of one's own concepts, beliefs, feelings, characteristics, and desires, both conscious and unconscious, onto their understanding of the world. But of course, bear in mind, this says nothing about intention right here, not yet. It's possible to project with good intentions. It's possible to project with bad intentions, with wholesome intentions towards freedom, with unwholesome intentions with the interest to violate other people. So just because you got involved with a narcissist doesn't mean you're a narcissist. It doesn't mean you had their same intention. Maybe you aspire to some sort of facet of them, which can be used in a very wholesome way. But it does not mean that you hold responsibility necessarily for, certainly not for their behavior, and maybe not even for their intention. Only you know that. I mean, I'm speaking from my own experience here, and from what I see from many other people around this world, a far greater problem is not seeing things as they are and projecting goodness onto people when it's not there, when it isn't being exhibited at that time. So hopefully what I'm about to share will be very useful to help delineate. The two terms are somewhat synonymous. Not all projection entails empathy, though, because empathy has a more wholesome connotation and tends to imply wholesome intentions, right? So when we say projection, it tends to have a slightly negative connotation, but it's actually the same process. It's this psychic intentionality. So the projection matrix. Not only do you unconsciously project unwholesome qualities onto the world and onto others, but hang on a second, you can also unconsciously project wholesome qualities. So Jung talked about this at length, and the need to experience the symbolic value of the image. So even if you've encountered this outright abuser, right, it could be a serial killer or something, what was it about them that attracted you? Maybe it wasn't that they were inherently good. I mean, they could have been a completely self-murdered individual, and yet at the same time had some kind of skill or quality or virtue that, when transmuted by you with wholesome intentions, can actually be used for good. Okay, so we have to be willing to go there. But this is just to say that as much as you project unwholesome qualities onto others and see dishonesty, see selfishness, see cruelty, and all of that stuff in the other, you can also project wholesome qualities. They can be elements of your own personal unconscious. They can be elements of archetypes. They can be desires and feelings. If you're in a good mood, then the world seems happy, right? We've all had this experience. So only you can know what's going on here. Only you can decide ultimately. And you can certainly use help, both from your higher self through the tools I'm sharing, but also from coaches and therapists and anyone else you can talk to. So there's that first differentiation. But hang on a second. There's also conscious, right? Because just because I know that the constellation of Leo looks like a series of stars in the sky, and I know that when I look at the constellation, I'm really seeing my own projection of Leo, it doesn't automatically disappear. And in much the same way, you can project something that you know full and well and are very conscious of. It's something you've integrated deeply in yourself, and you have a very sound conceptual understanding of it. And you can then see that in other people. And at the same time, it's possible to do the same with unwholesome qualities. You can recognize it, you can call it out, you can be honest with yourself about what you're seeing, and maybe even share it skillfully if needed. But just because you're aware of something unwholesome, it doesn't mean you can't project it onto the external world. In fact, Marie-Louise von Franz talked about this as well, that understanding evil in yourself actually makes you more capable of seeing it in the world. So contrary to what a lot of shadow content and shadow coaches might say, if you're seeing something in the world, it might actually be because you know what it is, not because you don't know what it is. So be very discerning in not only in what you make of experience, but in how you think about these things. But there is more, of course, and I won't go into huge detail again over this. It's in the previous course. But there's a really key distinction that it's really time that we started thinking about this and calling intention for what it is. We do have freedom. We do have free will to move towards selfhood or away from it, to attain greater freedom and self-knowledge or less, or to violate it, to avoid ourselves, to avoid feeling in the name of expedience, and instead to put forward our self-image and subjugate and dominate others in service of that. That's the master-slave dynamic. We can do that if we choose. We'll create problems doing that. We will brush up ultimately against ourselves and of the world, of course. Because any wise person who's honoring freedom, encountering that, is going to respond to it appropriately. They're not going to deem themselves judge, jury, and executioner all in one, but they will make the decisions they need to make to honor their own freedom. This is why we don't have anarchy. This is why we do put people in jail. It has to be done. There's a whole other conversation about how we do that and what the best way is, and very complex. But in principle, sometimes the way to honor freedom is to carefully and astutely limit someone else's, because in truth, they've actually limited their own. It's when we go beyond what they've actually done and start deeming ourselves the ultimate arbiter in such things that we start to abuse freedom in turn. So the key point here is that even if you partner with someone who is just beyond words malignant, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are malignant, okay? And it probably doesn't mean that, because you may have noticed these wholesome qualities in them. They may well have acted as the hook for that projection. They may well have done some wholesome things, even if they were with an unwholesome intention, ultimately, with manipulative intentions. But even though they might have been using it to bolster their self-image and avoid themselves, you can still use those same qualities to move towards selfhood. So it doesn't mean that you are evil or anything like this if you've encountered someone like that. This is a really important distinction that is oh so rarely discussed. So, I've given this caution before, but if you're doing shadow work and you're being told simply that, well, this is in your shadow, that's in your shadow, with no discussion of empathy or intention, or even of what that could even mean, then I think there's a lot more to be exploring here. It's in obfuscation and this kind of vague merging of concepts that evil is able to do its work by doing one thing and calling it another. But it's through incisiveness and this sort of splitting of concepts. We say, no, it's not that, it's actually this. And we can call it that and do so objectively. That brings us to the end of this episode. So thank you for your time and attention. If you enjoyed it, then please leave me a like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. If you're listening to this on the podcast, I always appreciate ratings and reviews as well. For the Know Yourself program, simply head over to knowyourself.makeitconscious.com, and I'll see you soon.